I was asked to speak to the question of how whiteness has been constructed and maintained historically. This is a topic that historians got really interested in, actually, in the 1960s, around the time of the Civil Rights Movement. And historians had long debates, many volumes, over questions of, why did Westerners enslave Africans? Did they enslave Africans because they were racist, or did racism emerge out of slavery? Over the course of about a generation, I think something of a consensus emerged in answer to that question, and that's that although Europeans brought to their encounters with non-Europeans, whether they were indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere or Africans, they brought a lot of prejudices that they expressed in a variety of ways, but those prejudices didn't constitute what we would today call race, an idea that people have permanent inheritable attributes that are connected to things like their morality or their habits. Basically, Europeans noticed that people looked differently and behaved differently, and they often brought a sense of superiority, believing that they were better than the people that they encountered, but they tended to attribute these things to culture. And in fact, religion often played a major part, right? And so Africans or people in the Americas would be described as heathens, but not typically as racially different in the modern usage of that term. So when we start talking about where the idea of whiteness comes from, or where the idea of race comes from, we need to look to the modern world as the product of the encounters between Westerners and Africans and indigenous people in the 15th and 16th and 17th and 18th century. I think, especially in the American context, there are other factors at work, but in the American context, the primary thing that historians look to is slavery as an explanation for how Europeans transitioned from thinking of themselves as Englishmen or Christians into thinking of themselves as white people who were biologically superior to all of the rest of creation. And so what I've passed out, this is actually just sort of an exercise that I often give in a class, like an introduction to American history class or history of slavery class. And what this does is it's just a sort of synopsis of about a century's worth of laws in colonial Virginia that are in some way connected to this topic of slavery, race, whiteness, and so on. And in fact, this was sort of the battleground of that first generation of historians who were arguing about, right, what kind of came first, racism or slavery. And so they looked a lot at these sorts of laws. The end result of all of this historiography of the emergence of slavery and racism in places like Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas is that the emergence of slavery as a system and of racial consciousness was not an overnight phenomenon, right? It took decades to develop, and this period is often called by historians now the terrible transformation. This is a period of roughly 50 or 70 years during which the colonies centered around Chesapeake Bay transitioned from a very ruthless, brutal, exploitative system not based upon race to an even more brutal and exploitative system that was based upon race and racial slavery in particular. And I think we see three things going on in in these laws, and I'll ask you to sort of comment on how you see this happening, but generally speaking, for the emergence of race and whiteness as a concept to emerge in this period, we have to see three things happening. One is the original legal justification for enslaving people was not race, because the racial consciousness did not exist. It was religion. So Christian Europeans felt entitled to enslave non-Christian whoever's. In the Middle Ages, they enslaved other non-Christian Europeans. In the early modern era, they enslaved non-Christian Africans or indigenous people and so on. So one of the things we have to see happening is a process of disconnecting the legal foundation of slavery from religion and substituting something else. In this case, ancestry or color, which becomes race in the modern period. Two, the laws create and police a system of racial boundaries, and this really clearly, I think, is done not only to create a sort of more, it's not perfectly coherent, but a more coherent definition of who is eligible to be enslaved, but it's also done in order to prevent solidarity from emerging, right, between, for example, poor Europeans and poor Africans. And finally, we see a process whereby poor whites, Englishmen, Christians, they're typically called in early laws, eventually they start being identified as white per se. They have to be invested with white privilege. And this, right, makes them hold on to their identity and value it as something in its own right, and also makes them much more willing to become complicit in maintaining the new system of racial slavery that's emerging at this time. So here's the exercise. Glance over these laws, and let's talk about how we see these things happen. Which of the laws are disconnecting slavery from religion and connecting it to ancestry or color? Which are creating and policing racial boundaries, which are investing poor whites with racial privilege. Anybody?
Oh, yours and your feet.
Oh yeah, right, yes. Yes, I'm waiting.
It's late in the afternoon for our day.
Well, in like 1662, would everyone have been saying that if you're a Christian and a black person or African or whatever, it would be double the normal fine? So is that where you're saying the solidarity, how they're like separating just a Christian versus European versus?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are multiple interesting things going on here, right? So, so one thing we can look at it when we look at a law is we can ask, what does the law suggest is happening, right? So, if elites in Virginia's House of Burgesses passed a law to prevent fornication between Christians and Negroes, what does that suggest is happening in Virginia?
They were listening to a lot of Barry White.
Well, I mean, it suggests, when we see laws that make it against the law for Europeans and Africans to sleep together, or which create additional punishments for ones who run away together, right? This suggests that they are in fact doing those things. And we can see in this early period in Virginia, in these laws and elsewhere, that it's quite common. Africans and Europeans work alongside together, they run away together, they fight, they have children together. Before it's outlawed, they marry each other, right? But these sorts of laws are designed to create and police these racial boundaries as they're emerging to prevent these things from happening.
I think that one's also kind of an interesting one because it kind of shows the complexity of this process because at the same time, this doesn't seem to be disconnecting it from religion. It seems to be kind of reinforcing those boundaries, and yet it is creating and policing racial boundaries.
Yeah, the word Christian is used repeatedly in 18th century law, and it's tricky to trace out exactly where Christian means Englishman and where Christian means people who have converted to Christianity. But we do see, I mean, we know this for fact, there is legal record of it. Africans who were enslaved, and the legal basis of their enslavement was the fact that they weren't Christian. Some of them converted to Christianity, sued for and won their freedom, and became free peoples, which obviously creates a sort of problem for slaveholders who want to maintain their property rights in these people. So where do we see that example of the justification for slavery being divorced from religion? Andrew?
1667.
Wonderful. Yeah, right, 1667, whereas some doubts, and that's an interesting phrase, right? Virginians in the House of Burgesses were debating whether or not conversion to Christianity should result automatically in the emancipation of an African. And they debated it, and at the end of their debate, right, they passed a law that said, even if you convert to Christianity, you will not become emancipated. Now there's a problem with the slave system, right? There's no longer a religious justification for slavery. So what is substituted? Yes. Yeah, right in the very next law, 1670. The 1670 law prohibits free Negroes and Indians from buying Christian servants, and it defaults all Africans imported from Africa into a lifetime of slavery, right? So now, place of origin, and in the case of the 1662 law, right, birth to an enslaved woman, right, automatically makes one a slave. How about investing poor whites with racial privilege? Where do you see that?
Well, 1680. There.
1680, okay. If any Negro, notice this is irrespective of status, right? Free, enslaved, slaveholder, and there were in colonial Virginia sometimes Africans who owned both slaves and indentured servants. But if any Negro, irrespective of class, lift up his hand against any Christian, irrespective of status, he shall receive 30 lashes. Might ask, what kind of behavior is this kind of law likely to encourage among white people? I mean, it's an authorization to be a bully, right? This sometimes reminds me of my sister, who was sort of a bully, would wear her soccer shin pads to school and then run around kicking everybody, right? And then how about this? Really, I think this is just one of the most interesting things. In the same legislative session in 1705, masters cannot whip a Christian servant naked, and all property held by slaves to be confiscated by the church and sold for the benefit of poor whites. What do you make of that law, cannot whip a Christian servant naked? Can you whip them? You can still whip your white indentured servants, but you can't whip them naked, right? And by extension, what do we assume you can do to Africans? Right? Why would they pass this law alongside a law that says all property held by slaves to be confiscated by the church and sold for the benefit of poor whites?
You take away your clothes, you're taking away the dignity for one thing.
Yeah. I mean, it is clearly designed to degrade and demean Africans in the eyes of white people. And it also, right, is reserving for whites, here is even if you're an unfree person, an indentured servant, even if you're being whipped, right, there is this, you have this status that will protect you from the worst form of abuse, right? This is, I mean, it's sort of the essence of white privilege, right? There is a status that comes along with being white that is separate from whether you're a wealthy white person or a poor white person, right? The goal is to make it clear to whites that they are on the same team, right, as the people making the laws, and that they should be loyal to that team. And in fact, right, I mean, this is just sort of a case study in colonial Virginia, but this is a pattern that's repeated throughout American history. So, generally speaking, in colonial America, voters were white male property holders. But in fact, the way the laws were written, the property requirements were often the sort of the most important part of that. And so it was mostly white men who were the property holders and qualified to vote. But in fact, in colonial America, sometimes people of color who owned property did qualify to vote. When the franchise was expanded in the 19th century, in the 1820s and 1830s, the country moved towards universal white manhood suffrage. All white men could vote, and in fact, none but white men could vote, right? And so this is an expansion of citizenship and political participation to poor white men, and it's an expansion that elites would not have granted, right, if they couldn't trust those white men to stay on team white, right? And we see this in all sorts of other places, right? So between 1790 and basically 1965, with few exceptions, right? You must be white to become a naturalized citizen in the United States. We see in the 20th century, most of the landmark social legislation, like the Social Security Act and the Federal Housing Act, the GI Bill, this sort of legislation is either written explicitly or implemented in such a way as to extend benefits to whites of modest means, but to exclude everybody else, right? So there is a sort of bargain that poorer whites or whites of modest means made with the establishment a long time ago to basically consent to the system that we have in return for certain rewards that we get in the form of better access to government services, better access to jobs, the psychological wages of whiteness, as W.E.B. Du Bois called them, right? The sense of worth that comes with being a part of the master race, even if you're not a master yourself.